Hello, everybody. My name is Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. With me today is, of course, Albert Świdziński from Strategy and Future, and our favorite guest, Louis Vincent Gaff. Already have been you've been a few times to our show. Hello, Louis. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
We're fine, although in the dark winter, almost winter in Poland, where it's cold and really horrible and very dark.
Well, you get nice summers.
True. We have had already a few shows together. We were discussing the world of currencies, empires, the future. But this time around, we want to ask you, and we want to venture into the future, where the United States doesn't hold the strategy of primacy, of preponderance. Of course, it's a little bit counterfactual today, since the Biden speech over the Israel and Gaza thing and Ukraine for like 3 weeks ago, where he stuck to the primacy strategy at any cost that the United States will be the arsenal of democracy. And why we want to ask this question as the opening, question of our conversation is that we increasingly think here in Poland that the strategy of primacy, of preponderance for the United States is unbearable. At least, Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu used to say that, in order to have some objective, the objectives must equal the means to reach the objectives. Otherwise, it's a bluff. And if it's a bluff, it's being challenged and tested along the peripheries. And Poland is in the periphery of the system. So we very dearly look at the event. So the question is, what would happen to the US dollar, which is the subject of your, all interviews actually, if the United States decided to do, as opposed to the primacy, the offshore balancing and withdraw from Eurasia, but would remain in the point-to-point, situations to create a proper balance of power? Would that change
If I could,
Albert, go ahead.
Add some parameters just quickly, because most of its history, US followed either offshore balancing or non-interventionism. It really ends with creation of NATO, first alliance they entered since military alliance since treaty with France that was terminated in 1800, and it was pretty much based on containment of the USSR. But the key element of it, the one that stabilized and in turn was stabilizing the international environment, was open economic order, right? The liberty, the freedom of strategic flows. This is what really served as a backbone of this entire system. This is why the US felt it must stabilize the entire system for it to work. And we see that the US is moving away from this already. They didn't join the TPP, and that was a constant between two administrations, right? Trump and Biden. They followed the exact same policy. We see more and more that the US elites have drawn a conclusion that it doesn't really serve their economic interests, hence the reindustrialization, the industrial policy. So the US is kind of by itself dismantling this very foundation of their world order, really. So what happens if they succeed, right? What happens if they decide that it doesn't really serve their interests anymore? Which I think you made this point before, that you look at what happened to the industrial class in the US and how actually spending patterns could change once the blue collars regain their buying power, their spending power, which I paid a lot of attention to when you said that. So this is what it boils down to.
Yeah.
All right. Well, first, thanks again for having me, and let's dive right into it, because that's probably the single most important question in the world right now. Basically, what you're asking is the world that we've known for the past 70 years or 80 years the world of tomorrow, or does it change really dramatically? Now, I think there's many different ways to answer that question. One way I would start off by saying is that, just like you pointed out, Biden's speech, I can't remember what it was, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, right after the October 7th events, where he basically came out and said, look, we can fight two wars. We're the United States, we can fight two wars on two fronts, no problem. And the markets didn't like that speech, right? The bonds sold off and the dollar sold, because undeniably, having an administration that commits to a bunch of bunch of costly wars, isn't great for markets. So I'll put that aside for now. But it was a fairly hawkish speech, and again, the markets didn't like it. So that's one signal that potentially some people would be listening to. Now, the second point I'd point out is the one you made, Albert, about the U.S. pulling away already from primacy. And here, I would say that there's a clear clash between, on the one hand, U.S. business leaders and U.S. policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
I think U.S. business leaders have been pulling away from U.S. primacy for a long time. I mean, they're the ones who are responsible for deindustrializing the U.S. They're the ones who are very much for globalization. Let's cut back our military expenses, etc. And on the other, I think a U.S. political class that remains fundamentally neoconservative, from right to left, that remains fundamentally, interventionist and fundamentally very keen on having 800 American military bases around the world. And so there's a clash there. And if anything, perhaps pictured this clash was the recent APEC meeting, where you had Xi Jinping invited to dinner with all the American business leaders, who all stood up and applauded him and treated him as if he was, a really great guy, and as if they were all best of friends. And meanwhile, the U.S. administration is obviously giving very different signals vis-a-vis China. So I think if you're Xi Jinping, and you're probably not used to this sort of divergence in messaging between the business sector on the one hand, and you were probably a little confused. One day you're being feted as a hero, and the other you're being treated like a second cousin coming out from the backwoods. That is a little bit embarrassing. So I highlight this because I don't want to bail out of your question, but it's deep down, who makes policy in the U.S.?
Yeah, exactly. Whether there's a balance between business and political life, because I met once a French guy who was an heir to Huguenots who were expelled from France, and he told me, sure, on the continent it's always the political life that rules. In the islands, there's a balance between political life and capital. And that's why stock exchanges, the most important are in London and New York City, and so who calls the shots? And the more refined questions: do you think that all kinds of business are like already abandoned primacy? All production business, I think it already sees China as a competitor, right, as opposed to financial business. So maybe there are some distinctions between kinds of business in the United States. What do you think?
So I think in the short term, to answer your question, I think in the short term the politicians make the call. In the long term, the businesses influence the policy. And this is especially true in the U.S., where the power of lobbying is such, the strength of the lobbyist is so deep that I tend to think that over time the business leaders have their way. And it doesn't happen immediately, but they influence the media, they influence popular culture, and over time they tend to have their way. But it's you can't have business be blatant, and it's a slow moving process. But look, I think if China joined the WTO in 2001. In 2001, you'd said, look, in 20 years, this is where U.S. industry will be, and you describe the current situation. Nobody would have signed up for it.
Yeah.
They would have said, no way. But in the meantime, you've had a hell of a bull market in the U.S. Business has done extremely well. U.S. American business have done extremely well at globalization. So for business people, it's worked out. For the working class, not great. For the country as a whole, you could say, well, if you look at industry today, in 2001, Chinese industry was 1/3 the size of US industry. Today, it's 60% bigger than US industry. Now, this comes back to your question of primacy, is at the end of the day, in the modern era, warfare, if you ever get to that, warfare is a test of one industrial base against another. Is, you know, how strong is your industrial base? And or it might not be all of only that, but that's a big component today of warfare. Today, Chinese industry is 60% bigger than US industry. China's come from nowhere 5 years ago to be the biggest auto exporter, biggest machine tool exporter, etc. So, and that spread continues to widen every year. So, can you have, you know, and again, I'm not talking the next 6 months, but the next 10 years, 20 years. Can you have the country that basically doesn't have industry to be the, you know, to hold primacy in the world? I guess, you know, if you had people from the technology world on this call, they would say, sure, you can, because industry was, you know, the Second World War and the First World War. But in the modern day and age, it's no longer about armies at each other. It's going to be about, you know, space, the conquest of space. It's going to be about you know, cyber warfare. It's no longer about men in trenches. I know you guys are at the border of a war with men in trenches, but that's in essence a remnant of a past age. And by the way, just as a sign, the fact that Russia is, you know, has done it with this war seems to be slowly grinding out Ukraine, that has done the support of the whole of Europe and the United States, tells you that this dislocation on industry is no longer to the great advantage of the Western world. We no longer have a huge comparative advantage there. So then you become a quest of, okay, if war is about one industrial complex against another, then the US is bound to lose primacy. If war is about one technological complex against another, then it's up and ended. But the longer time goes, the more China can catch up. Today, the US has primacy there, no problem. You know, they dominate the tech world. But each year, China now graduates more engineers than the US has. China right now is graduating 12 million kids a year. I just wrote a paper on this. 12 million kids a year from university. It is moving extremely rapidly in all the STEM subjects. So you look at all this and you say, okay, if I project this over the next 10 years, how can China not also dominate the tech world when they're producing that many more engineers? If you start off with "Il n'est de richesse que d'homme," the only wealth is man, then you know the primacy is about to change. Now, again, if it happens through business decisions, it's going to be slow moving, no shock, nobody hurt. If it happens through political decision, it might be more painful.
Yeah, but still, if Albert, if I'm asked, but let me come back to the original question about the US dollar. You know, so why not? Why not the U.S. business just pressing the political life? Okay, guys, you know, let's give up on this primacy thing. Offshore balancing is good enough because we are, you know, the most important from the equal ones, and we have the safe harbor in North America, and still we can make a deal that U.S. dollar is a currency of the world, because, you know, like with Windows, you described this phenomenon. You know, it's very difficult to abandon the current world currency. So, you know, there are some still upsides of it, and there is no war, nothing. Yeah. So why not?
So I think that's a great question. That deal would be very good for American businesses. You could see why they'd want to push it. Having said that, I think most businesses just they don't think in big terms. They think in terms of narrow interest. You know, what's my interest right here, right now? A deal that maintains the US dollar as the world's reserve currency and trading currency, I think is no longer acceptable to a China. And the reason for that, to be honest, is the weaponization of the dollar over the past 10 years by the U.S. administration. That deal might have been acceptable 10 years ago, before the dollar was weaponized against Iran, against Venezuela, and most recently against Russia.
Against France.
Yeah, and against France with BNP. That was really the first shot across the bow. When BNP got, I think it was like a $2.5 billion fine for doing a deal in Sudan. That basically signaled to a country like China that when you trade in US dollar, you are fundamentally dependent on the US Treasury. In essence, the message the US sent with the BNP fine a little over 10 years ago was when you do a deal in dollars, you might think that this is a two-way deal, but it's a three-way deal. The US Treasury can always get in the middle of it, see what you're doing, approve, disapprove. And if you've got superpower ambitions, or even regional power ambitions, like a China does, that deal is unacceptable. You can't accept a deal where the U.S. Treasury can come in and say, "Yeah, we don't want you to make it." No sovereign nation can really accept it.
But also, if you look at the impact that making dollar a global transactional currency had on U.S. industry, not business, but industry, it was extremely detrimental, right? It makes their exports non-competitive, really.
So I think initially, in the first sort of 20 or 30 years after the war, it was terrific. And then over time, I think basically to your point, it becomes detrimental. It almost becomes like you're having Dutch disease, where instead of producing, say, oil, and you produce oil and to the detriment of everything else, it's even better. You don't even need to produce oil; you just produce dollars. And fund consumption, and so you get to the point where we are today, where the U.S. is now, it's basically in full employment. It has nominal GDP growth of 7 or 8%. The U.S. economy is most likely at a cyclical high right now, and with that, you've got budget deficits of 8% of GDP. Because in essence, just like a country that has Dutch disease, the government could afford to not be fiscally responsible. But you can do that for a while, but you can't do it forever. Is the problem.
But is it really so, Louis, that it's about, the test is if anybody has tested really the length, how long you can do it. And I think, of course, I've checked the, we read Ray Dalio about, all those cycles, the empires, but there was no empire of the kind as the United States is in terms of, its importance to the world. Because at the end of the day, where would the investors go?
So that's a very important question, and it's a little bit like tequila shots, right? You never know. You never know when you've had enough until you've had too much. And government and budget deficits are the same. It's almost quite binary. You add them up, and it's no problem. It's no problem. It's no problem. And then all of a sudden, the market chokes on it and says, "You know what? I can't take it anymore. I can't do this." We saw this in Southern Europe, right? In 2011, 2012. Now, to your point, where would investors go? One of the examples I've used a lot in talks and my research, etc., is imagine a Chilean copper mine, let's say Antofagasta or whichever, or Brazilian Valley. It doesn't matter. Historically, these guys would buy Caterpillar machines, right? And because they knew that there'd always be a point in the cycle where your Chilean investment bank, your U.S. banks would not want to lend to Chile or would not want to lend to Brazil, they always kept dollars in working capital. So they could always pay Caterpillar. So they always had a lot of working capital in dollars. Now here comes Longhua Machinery, say, don't buy Caterpillar, buy Longhua, 2/3 of the price, and I'll fund it for you in your local currency. So now all of a sudden, I don't need to keep US dollars in my working capital. It's not that I change them for something else, is I just don't need them anymore. As more and more trade moves into other currencies, your need to keep precautionary savings in dollars, whether in central bank reserves or in or in cash in working capital just disappear. So you don't. I get the point. People tell me, well, surely people aren't going to replace dollars with renminbi because who trusts the Chinese, or people aren't going to, who trusts the euro? Nobody wants to do that. But in fact, you end up needing less precautionary capital, and I think that's what the world is going through right now, which is perhaps one of the reasons why growth has turned out to be much better than most people expect.
Yeah, but it's still long term. It's very difficult to keep the so to say stability in exchange if there is no some currency, world currency. It's very difficult to keep a long lasting.
Oh, it makes for a much more unstable.
Yeah,
it makes for a much more unstable world unless let's say you have a new exporting superpower. Let's call it China, because frankly that's what it is, and that exporting superpower turns to the people it is exporting to and that it likes. Let's call them Indonesia, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, and says, hey, I'll sign a central bank swap deal so that if ever you run short of, I know, like right now, don't bother keeping dollars. Just don't bother keeping dollars. You can pay me in local currency. You can pay me in renminbi. And tell you what, if you run out of renminbi, I'll lend you some. So that there's not a short-term hit. I can lend you some. So, and we've seen Argentina do this, right? Argentina runs out of dollars to pay its trade with China. China says, okay, I'll lend you the renminbi so you can pay me back, and we can, you can pay me back later. In that situation, the inherent volatility that you would have had by removing the dollars completely disappears. And that is precisely what we're seeing today. We're seeing trade with China explode. And on the back of this trade, China comes in and says, hey, well, get rid of your US dollars and sign a swap deal with me. Let's do our trade in renminbi, and I will back your trade. I will back our trade. And you're seeing it everywhere. Just last week, you had what I think is one of the most important macro development of the past year, which is China signed a swap deal with Saudi Arabia, of all countries. Saudi, the 51st state, for all intents and purposes. It's, this is somewhat mind blowing. Now, you could wonder, why the hell would Saudi need renminbis? They produce oil, priced in dollars, export it. They got a currency pegged to the dollar, and most of what they buy, wheat, weapons, is priced in dollars. Why would they need an RMB swap? Two options: either they're planning to buy a whole lot more from China, in the not so distant future, or at some point they're going to break their peg to the dollar, and they're doing a backup to make sure they don't have too much currency volatility. So yeah, I think if China wasn't on the backstop, with all these currency swaps, it would be very volatile. As it turns out, it might be less volatile.
Also, if I could, when you speak of dollar, I think if developing markets, developing countries cease, using dollar for their trade or for their investment, this really frees up their ability, because this was, I think you mentioned this was a huge backstop towards their development, right? Because they had to source dollars for investment infrastructure. And if they can trade in their local currency or have swaps, right, with China or even with other countries, this instantly removes one of the key barriers to development, right?
Absolutely. Well, look, if you move from a world where you have one supplier, say Caterpillar, and one funder, say JP Morgan, to a world where you have two or three and many sources of funding, the odds that you get squeezed at the bottom of the cycle, the odds that you have to cut your orders at precisely the wrong time go down considerably. But it also means that you've had 30 years of massive U.S. current account deficit accumulation around the world, sitting in the working capital of the Antofagastars or the Vales of this world, as well as sitting on local central banks, whether in Peru, in Colombia, in China, wherever else. And if everybody turns around and says, okay, I now need fewer dollars to cushion my trade, cushion my economy, to make sure I don't have a shock. I now need fewer dollars than I had before. Then all these dollars have a vocation to come back into the U.S. it's like, if I don't need these dollars. Now, the problem is then what do you do with them? Maybe that's what we're seeing today. Maybe that's why, people decide, I don't need as many US treasuries. I don't know what to do with these dollars. So I'm just going to buy Microsoft. I'm just going to buy Google. I'm just going to buy Facebook because I'm not quite sure what to do with them. So I'll just do that. So all these dollars come back. Now, logically, as the dollars come back into the US, it should see a weaker US dollar as well. Which so far we haven't seen. Although, the US, it's been a pretty aggressive Fed tightening cycle, and the US dollar hasn't gone out to break the highs we saw in 2020. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe we're starting to see the rollover.
Exactly. When you listen to the debate in the United States, they seem pretty confident that they would go through all this thing, including the debt crisis and stuff. They talk about the new revolution of AI that would increase productivity, and they will simply jump over this sort of the steep fiscal issue. And what is your the take on that? It's they claim that this is a new economy. You can have as much debt as you wish. We will make it. The world has to buy. And if there is any war in Eurasia, we can also offset any debts. Because we are the superior military power. So at the end of the day, we will be imposing rules whether we need to pay back or not. To cut long story short, yeah.
Yeah. And so far, that's been proven right. In fairness,
Yeah.
So far that's been proven right. And now, I tend to think that over the long term, the currency is the ultimate variable of adjustment. So I don't think the U.S. faces a debt crisis per se. That bond yields in the U.S. are going to go to 20%. That it's going to be an absolute disaster. It doesn't need to be that way because the Fed can always step in, print money, buy the debt, basically do what Japan did with the yield curve controls, which I think ultimately is where the U.S. will end up. And when it ends up there, you will see the U.S. dollar go down. So again, the variable of adjustment will be the dollar. Now, you could say, well, to be honest, the dollar is pretty overvalued against every major currency today. It's massively overvalued against the yen. It's marginally overvalued against the euro. I think China, the renminbi is very undervalued. You don't run a 75 billion a month trade surplus if your currency isn't undervalued. So one of the anomalies out there is the US dollar is too high. So the first, 20 or 30% drop in the US dollar won't feel bad at all. It'll feel absolutely fine. And so to your question, are we going to see a big cataclysmic event where everybody thinks, oh my God, the US has changed, etc.? Probably not for a while. Because first, right now we've had a big adjustment in the bond market. Next comes the adjustment in the currency market. And once you have the adjustment in the currency market, you'll probably start to see proper inflation in the US. And once you see proper inflation in the US, there you'll have a political crisis. Most political crises are triggered by inflation. That might sound very German of me, but yeah. I think, or even very Marxist.
You made it. You made it on Germans. Your French made it on Germans in Versailles. So you know how it works.
Exactly. Well, the Americans are going to end up doing it to themselves. You can't run budget deficits of 8% of GDP with full employment, and so I think there's little signs already that things are creaking. Like I said, I start off. I think the first thing I said was with Biden's primacy speech. Immediately, the bond market sold off and the dollar sold. It was almost as if he said, "Look, we can finance everything," and the market said, "Yeah, but we'll tell you the price at which you're going to finance this." You don't get to control the price at which you finance it. Was in essence the market saying. And since then, incidentally, you'll notice that there's been a lot of articles in the Washington Post and the New York Times, i.e., the organs of the CIA and the State Department, of we're backing off from basically supporting Ukraine to the very hilt. Maybe it's time to do a deal with Russia. Maybe it's time to sit down with Putin. things that would have been unprintable 18 months ago or even 6 months ago are now open conversation. It's like, okay, what deal can we get with this? So, why this shift? Is it because they realize that actually, perhaps they can't win a war against Russia, or is it B, they're getting tired of funding it? It's got to be one or the other.
Could you, if I could ask a a little narrow question about the impact, what's happening with the treasuries market in the US? You mentioned that this is one of the key stories, right?
Yep. Well, at its heart, it's more sellers than buyers. You've had a few failed auctions at the long end. Basically, the U.S. is starting to look a little bit like Brazil used to, where whenever the government tries to issue long-dated bonds, it finds that there's very little liquidity, nobody's interested, nobody shows up at the auctions are terrible. So the U.S. government really doesn't have much choice but to issue debt at the short end, and which is not a sign of health, right? When nobody's very keen to lend to you on a 10-year basis. If I lend to you money on a 6 months basis, but I won't lend to you money on a 10-year basis, is that I don't really trust you. And so that's basically where we are on the bond market.
Mm-hmm.
I think the market is growing very wary of U.S. Fiscal policy.
And I don't know, Jacek, if you want to interrupt, but I had one more macro question about, the rumors that Japanese will move away from negative interest rates, right? And that, from what I understood, this was a huge source of liquidity around the globe, right, for investment. And what would be the impact?
So I think that's the biggest thing that nobody's looking at. To be honest, that's when you look around the world today and you think, okay, what price makes no sense? What price is completely out of whack? A few years ago, it was negative interest rates everywhere, right? And you looked at that and you think that makes no sense. On a historical basis, on an economic basis, that makes no sense. Today, a yen at 150, which is more or less where it's hovering against the US dollar, means the yen is undervalued on a purchasing parity basis by about 50%. Now, it's one thing if the Polish zloty or the Swedish krona is undervalued by a lot. But Japan is the second or third biggest industrial power in the world, depending on how you measure it. It's the second or third biggest industrial power in the world. To have such an important economy run such an undervalued currency is deeply deflationary for the rest of the world. Now, the other thing, and to your question, Japan is also one of the biggest savers in the world, and it's the biggest exporter of savor. So the fact that it has such low interest rates, I think, has kept bond yields in check all over the world because the Japanese kept buying bonds abroad. So if you foresee a shift in the Japanese interest rate policies, it's hard not to imagine that it'll have a big impact on the yen, that it'll have a big impact on bond yields everywhere, and that fundamentally it'll be a bit of an inflationary shock. If the yen moves from 150 to 130, the price of your Toyota is going to be coming up. And there is no doubt that Japan today it's just too cheap. It's like the yen is that can't last forever.
Yeah. Okay. I read the newest book by Lynn Alden about the broken money. That's the title.
Yeah.
She posits that it would be much better.
Great book.
The United States would be much better off if it became U.S. the country as opposed to U.S. the empire. After the relatively short period of adjustment, everything is in the United States: resources, food, water, territory, people, demographics, and they would be much better off. It's only the matter of time for the politicians to realize that this is the option. Otherwise, there is no way out of this cycle. What do you think?
So first, I think it's a great book, and that everybody should buy it and read it. The second thing I would say is politicians don't change, voters do. and then the voters change the politicians. That's the great advantage we have as a democracy. Is it's the advantage we have in a democracy isn't that we pick the best people for the job, is that we get rid of the bad ones without bloodshed, without you can. Now, I think U.S. policymakers don't want to walk away from empire because it's the perks of empire if you're a U.S. politician are tremendous. Now, to Lynn's point, for the U.S. population, I agree with her that it would be better to be a country and not an empire. But note that that was Pat Buchanan's slogan back when he ran against George Bush in 1992: "A republic, not an empire." That was his slogan in 1992, and obviously he didn't win. But that you've had that undercurrent in the U.S. for a long time. There's been big winners out of the U.S. being an empire. Obviously, all the U.S. multinational companies, big tech, the U.S. military-industrial complex, the financial world, all of that have been big winners out of the empire. The big losers, basically U.S. manufacturing, U.S. industry, and the 100,000 people who die out of fentanyl every year, who are more or less these blue-collar workers very often, who fall into the fentanyl despondency. So, if you move away from empire and back into being a republic, then you have a very, very different country, and there'll be a big losers. It'll be really bad for the financial industry. It'll be really bad for the U.S. military-industrial complex. The fastest growing real estate market in the U.S. and now the most expensive U.S. real estate market is the greater Washington, D.C. area. The U.S. moves from being a republic to an empire. You can sell Washington, D.C. real estate with both hands. So it'll be a very, very different country. Will it be a better country? Will the wealth be more equally spread? Absolutely. I think the story of every empire is you end up with a concentration of wealth at the very seat of the empire. Whether you look at Rome, whether you look at Paris under Napoleon, you end up with tremendous wealth going to the heart of the empire, the British Empire with London or Vienna. I mean, you walk around Vienna, it's one of the most stunning cities in the world. All the wealth flows to the heart of the empire. But then the wealth gets spread out. Now, having said that, the periods of end of empires, and that'd be the counter argument to Lynn's point. It's pretty hard to move away from an empire to not being an empire and have tremendous wealth. Like you look at the Austrian and Hungarian Empire, when that ended, there was no wealth to be shared. When you look at the Ottoman Empire, when that ended, there was no wealth to be shared. You look at the end of the British Empire, the 1950s, 60s, 70s in London, that was no fun. It was no fun whatsoever. So the end of empires, it's pretty rare that it goes very well.
That they willingly give up their position. Absolutely, it would take great wisdom, right?
Give it up, and that they come out stronger economically on the other side of it. There's a period of adjustment that lasts at least 1 or 2 generations. Look at Japan. Japan was an empire, stopped being an empire. 40s, 50s, 60s. Japanese worked really hard to get to where they were, but there was a whole generation that really tightened its belt.
But then also, I remember when you speak of blue collars and their decreased importance. I think you mentioned in one of your recent podcasts that this trend is now turning, and you could measure it by the amount of strikes, right, of dockers, of truckers, of blue collar jobs that were looked down upon. And now you also have vocational schools, right, in the US coming back to life. And you made a very interesting point that apart from spending or like buying patterns, that will be drastically different, right? If it's no longer a guy in buying avocado toasts in California, it will be somebody in Ohio buying a steak, right? So, and this could then impact the political decision making, right? At the very long chain of events.
I think so. Again, things are slow moving because we're in democracies, but to your point, I do think what's quite striking in the U.S. today is that there's this massive dislocations where people still go out and take, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt so that they can go get an office job that will likely pay less than a blue collar job at this juncture. So you go out, you borrow hundreds of thousands, but meanwhile, if you're willing to, carry a blowtorch to work rather than, go into an air-conditioned office, that you'll make more money. But people still go for I need to get my college degree and I need to go to an air-conditioned office and I need to work on a laptop because I think socially we've been conditioned for it. Now, I think the US today is probably one of the very few countries, Canada probably another, maybe Australia another, where blue-collar jobs are actually now getting paid more than white-collar jobs. So you would think that over time, people will notice that and start switching. This takes a while, right? And this has just started to happen. It's perhaps the response to the extreme moves of the past, the looking down upon blue-collar workers that have done for the past.
Yeah. Plus, AI will also increase this tendency, I guess. That the AI will not replace the menial work.
That's right. That's right. Like if you need something welded together,
yeah, or you need a good plumber or a handyman in the house. It's
those jobs aren't going anywhere.
Exactly.
No, the interior design job. The interior design job can now probably be done by an AI. Yeah. But the moving the furniture in, you still need a guy with muscles in a truck.
Exactly. Yeah, just let's move to Europe for a while. So, as you know, there have been discussions recently heated up in Europe that we will have a new empire, the federal Europe. And Poland is being pushed to that corner. The negotiations sort of started. The propositions are, on the table. It's a major thing for Poland, which, always had, this knack for independence, and we don't trust Germans. So just to put it, politely, and
why wouldn't you?
Yeah, and and that's yeah. Don't trigger me, Louis, because that would
Sorry.
So basically, my question is what the markets say about prospects of a federal Europe. Do they trust that this might be happening, and is it feasible? Will the Germans seize their power? Because otherwise it's not going to happen. What the markets say about it?
So I think, look, the European project was always an imperial project. Yeah. It was always an imperial project from the get-go. And the only question is, what kind of empire were you going to devise in Europe? Was it like a very decentralized empire, where the model would have almost been, say, the Roman Catholic Church across the Middle Ages, where a very decentralized empire, everybody agrees to play more or less by the same set of rules. Everybody agrees more or less to the same set of beliefs. You have one leader perhaps sitting somewhere, but it's still very decentralized, and everybody's responsible for their own jurisdictions. That's one model. I'd call it the Roman Catholic model of empire. Or do you have a very centralized model for Europe, where all the powers all the decisions are taken at the center and passed on down? Now, needless to say, the guys who are building it want the latter. They want the deeply centralized, where decisions are made at the center, and more increasingly by people who are increasingly not elected, whether the European court judges, the guys sitting on the European commissions. Nobody knows quite who answers to whom. Decisions come out of nowhere. And I think, we've been pushed into that latter category. We were sold the Roman Catholic Empire of, look, we all believe in the same things. We believe in free trade. We believe in free exchange of people. We believe in kids moving around for studies. We were sold the Roman Catholic Empire, and we were delivered the centralized empire. Now, to your point, I think there is great reluctance everywhere on amongst the populations on the centralized empire. You just saw it in Poland with Geert Wilders. You saw it in Sweden with the New Democrats, and I think where the resistance was always the strongest, unsurprisingly perhaps, is on the fringes of the empire. So it was Britain. Britain said, "I'm out," and then it was on the eastern flank of the empire. The eastern flank of the empire, we always felt very uncomfortable with it because you guys were just in another empire and you didn't really like it. You were part of the Soviet Empire for all intents and purposes, and so I think there's an institutional memory of, you know what, I don't like it when we don't get to make our own decisions. Like, that just doesn't work for us. We've just done that, and it really didn't work for us. So I think the whole idea of having this centralized Europe I think it was dead on arrival. We're just going through the motions where more and more people are turning away from it. Whether those people are called Hungary, whether they're called Poland, whether they're called Holland, whether they're called Sweden, everybody is like increasingly saying, like, this, I'm out. This isn't for me. Sorry, you guys have fun. And so, yeah, and I think that explains partly the weakness of the euro. That explains why European stock markets have been so weak, because you have that political uncertainty overhanging over Europe, where you think, we're building these institutions, we know we're supposed to play by these rules, but we know these rules won't last. And, I think if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a businessman, if you're a CEO of a company, you don't really care what the rules are. You just want to know what they are, and then you adapt, right? The last thing you want when you're an entrepreneur is to not know what the rules will be in 5 years, 10 years time.
Oh.
And that's the problem with Europe. I think that's one of the main reasons nobody feels comfortable deploying capital.
But what would need to happen for the markets to really start believing that this is happening? What would be the triggers? For example, the promise by Germans that they would underwrite all debt all around the periphery at any in any circumstances. I don't know, forming of the army, a major 6 months long process, of a treaty like Treaty of Versailles, or the Congress of Vienna, or now Aquisgrán, that all those leaders meet and sign a constitution. What would be a trigger? In terms of the business minded people, that this is really happening. Maybe it's
what 2 years ago, maybe all three of us would have agreed, well, look, let's say you had a war between Russia and Ukraine, that would really mobilize Europe, really decide to, like, Europeans to get together and against the big bear Russian threat. It would focus the mind of European policymakers of what's important, what's not, etc. Maybe we would have said that 2 years ago, right? And we would have been wrong if we had. I would have said that perhaps 2 years ago, and 2 years later, here we are. What will work? I don't think anything will, because deep down it goes against the very nature of the European people. So I don't think you can sell European federalism to global investors because they don't buy it, and because there's always going to be a vote somewhere. And this week it's Holland, but in 18 months' time it might be Belgium, it might be somebody else, who knows. There's always going to be a vote that reminds you, actually, these guys don't want this. So I think what needs to happen for Europe to be an attractive destination for capital is a strong shift in at the European, Parliament level, European Constitution, for people to say, okay, look, you know what, we've heard you. We heard that you don't want the European super state, the European centralized state. We heard that you want more of the decision to be done at the local levels, which is by the way, most countries are heading. Most people want to have more decisions taken at a local level rather than at a top federal level. And for Europe to basically start evolving in that way and saying, you know what, we needed a centralized moment. When we absorbed all of Eastern Europe into the European Union, there was a huge gap. Western Europe was living here, and Eastern Europe was much poorer. They didn't have the infrastructure. But now Eastern Europe is caught up. You go to Eastern Europe, you've got roads, you've got airports, you've got railways. It's the same as Western Europe for all intents and purposes. So that has been done. we can cut the European budget. We can now devolve decisions to the outer fringes. Everybody can do their own thing. We don't need to have all the same rules for everybody on every single thing. If Hungary wants to have different marriage laws than Germany, that's fine. Have at it. If we come into that, so to your point, yeah, you meet up, you set up a sort of constitution, not that dissimilar to the U.S. Constitution, where you say whatever isn't delegated to the central government is the resort of local governments. And we only these things are, the central government's role, basically free trade and free movement of people and human rights. Only these few things. Everything else, boom, gets passed to the states. Done deal. Then I think people feel extremely comfortable bringing capital back into Europe. But when no one is there, because the policymakers, why would they? How often have you seen policymakers willingly give up power? In the U.S., they did it from scratch, and the Constitution was basically a compromise between individuals who were very attached to state rights, very attached to their own local communities. In Europe, I think what we have is typically policymakers who want more power at the center and want to move to the center, because if they move there, they don't have to answers to voters anymore. So it's much more attractive to be in Brussels.
True. Albert?
If I could have a kind of jumping all across the map, but I wanted to, I know we're running out of time. I wanted to ask you about, I was thinking when you mentioned before during our conversation today that, China is probably more looking to become a regional or to secure its sphere of influence, not really emulate what the US has done. I was thinking a lot recently about what would be the Chinese offer it presents to the world. And the more I think about it, the more it seems to me that it would try to offer a drastic jump in productivity, which hasn't really happened across the globe since the 90s, right? This was the last time when you saw an increase in productivity. Since then you didn't get this. So do you think it's possible for China to offer an entire ecosystem of solutions, hard infrastructure, roads and stuff like that, but also digital connectivity? And on top of this, for example, digital currencies, providing access to capital, to knowledge, to an ability to partake in global exchange to like billions and billions of people in the global south who never had a chance, who did sustenance farming or sold a kilo of taters by the road, and then if you provide them with liquidity, which they didn't have access to because no banking infrastructure, right? And you wouldn't trust them with the money anyway because they can spend on moonshine. But if it's CBDC, you can program it so they can only buy Chinese industrial machinery to improve their productivity, right? And then they can do it via Chinese handset, stuff like that. Is this something?
It doesn't end up in a Swiss bank account.
Say again?
And it doesn't end up in a Swiss bank account.
Yep, it just goes straight. It probably recirculates back to China. But again, there is some objective ability for those people in the global south to bring themselves up, right? Is this something that you see as possible?
Well, I don't know if you ever saw that clip on YouTube. I think it was the Kenya Prime Minister was talking with the British ambassador on a panel somewhere, and the British, the Kenyan Prime Minister says, when we go to the Western world, we get a lecture, and when we go to China, we get roads, hospitals, railroads, etc. And the British Prime Minister said, yes, but all these roads, railroads, etc. They come with strings attached. And then the Kenyan Prime Minister said, and here comes the lecture. And it was, quite telling. I think, to answer your question, there is no doubt that China's offering to the rest of the world today is one of prosperity. You mentioned productivity. What China tells the world right now is, look, let's try to get rich together. And that's, Xi Jinping's big win-win strategy, etc. They are trying to tell the world we can get rich together. The U.S., meanwhile, if you think, what's the U.S. selling strategy? The U.S. selling strategy is, look, we'll keep you safe. It's you come in our corner, and we'll make sure that you stay safe. And so, it's I think these two different strategies have different attractiveness for different people, right? If you're Poland and you're sitting between Germany and Russia, and you have the history that you have, the promise of, look, we'll keep you safe is a deeply attractive, right? It's one that you're bound to respond positively to. If you're, Mozambique, and you don't have a threat from anybody, and you trying to come say, look, we'll make you rich, that's an attractive proposition. So, different parts of the world, depending on their own concerns, are going to have, different responses to this. Now, interestingly, the linchpin in all of this might well end up being Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the U.S.'s promise to Saudi Arabia was, we'll always keep you safe. And so now, if you're MBS, you think, okay, what's my long-term threat to my regime, to my family staying in power? Is it A, Iran, in which case I need to be in bed with the United States? Or is it B, my own population, that someday there's a revolution and that I get upended, in which case I better side with China, because what I need is domestic prosperity to make sure that doesn't happen. Depending on where you place the threat, is my threat Iran or is it my own population? You either pick the US or you pick China.
Yeah, that's a very synthetic approach, to.
And it also brings us back to our very first topic, which is whether the US can keep primacy, which is providing safety, but it's ever more extensive because they have to secure periphery, and this just involves US everywhere, right? And then you
with
get
the thinner and thinner force, by the way. Yeah.
Well, and in fairness, the US, I think the US has basically decided we're not involved with Africa for all intents and purposes. They're not doing very much there. They've given it up to China. And they probably thought, what's Africa good for? Yeah, it's got great commodities, but a lot of the commodities we get in Africa, we can get either in the US or in Canada or in Latin America. We don't really need Africa. So they gave up on Africa. I don't think they want to give up on Asia. They don't want to give up on Europe, because then you've given up on everything. And because that's where all the global trade is going to happen. So to your point, I think the US says, okay, fine, we've given up Africa. China can have it. Maybe the next step is they give up on Asia and they keep Europe. Now, remember, Obama's pivot, etc., was that we're going to keep Asia. Asia is very important. We need Asia. And a lot of what they've done, the deals with India, the deals with Australia, shows the opening of military bases all over the Philippines, shows that they are committed to keeping Asia. I do think they want to keep Asia. But here's the thing, is if you're in Indonesia, if you're in Thailand, if you're in Malaysia, and the US comes and says, hey, we'll keep you safe, A, do you believe them? Do you believe that the US will really go to war against China for Indonesia? And the Singapore Prime Minister made that very statement a while back, basically condemning the Philippines, saying, look, Philippines, you're acting as if the US is going to have your back in war. Are you 100% sure of this? And that was always de Gaulle's thing, why France needed its own nuclear deterrent, etc. De Gaulle always felt that if push came to shove, the Americans would sacrifice Paris to save New York, because that's what he would have done. He just said it plainly. Like, if I was American president, I'd sacrifice Paris to save New York. I'm not going to sacrifice New York. If I'm American
of course,
president.
and Kissinger, by the way, hinted it as well when he was right after his term, that sure, we were not thinking about seriously about this. Of course we wouldn't, sort of.
Yeah, and so and the Prime Minister of Singapore reminded the President of the Philippines this very recently. He said, look, they're not going to sacrifice LA for Manila. Never. So, it's, and so if you're Asia, you might think, yeah, I believe the US, but the US has the option to not be in Asia. China doesn't have the option to not
Exactly.
And
The difference in resolve, yeah.
And tragic, because this is really a self-destruct and self-balancing mechanism when you get hegemony. You get those paradoxical results, because if you care about credibility so that you can build that system, you have to try to defend it in random places which don't really matter, in peripheral states, right? Bosnia in the 90s, or in Vietnam. But
Ukraine
this also
today.
kills your power, right? It cuts into your power.
Ukraine is of peripheral importance to the US. It's of vital importance to Russia.
Yes.
Yeah, true.
Asymmetry of resolve.
Yeah, true. Okay, Louis, that was marvelous as always.
Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, looking forward to the next one for sure. Thank you very much. Louis Vincent Gabo was our guest today.
You got me thinking about a lot of things.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.